Hello. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to ICTS. I see lots of new young faces. So perhaps it's the first time for many of you at ICTS. So ICTS is the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, and we interpret theoretical sciences very widely. And though our primary research is on theoretical physics, mathematics, quantitative biology, and so on, our programs that we organize are actually on a much wider canvas. And in some sense, we aspire to view knowledge in a sort of a even bigger unified way. And our small bit towards that is this D.D. Kosambi lecture. So perhaps many of you may not know who D.D. Kosambi is, which is why I thought I'll spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about him, because I think he is quite a remarkable personality about whom I think the younger generation should know a little bit about. So Kosambi was he was born in 1907, and so pre-independence India, and he died just the first generation after independence, 1966. He was a mathematician, he was a statistician, a philologist, historian, and a general polymath. And that's quite remarkable that we had such a person with such wide interests who contributed significantly in each of these topics. And besides, in fact, he has contributions through his mathematics and statistics to even genetics, where there is something called the Kosambi map function. He's well known for his work in numismatics and compiling of critical editions of ancient Sanskrit texts of Bhartrihari and so on. And he is particularly known for his classic work, An Introduction to the Study of Indian History, which sort of has influenced Indian historiography. But about him as an individual, there are some interesting facts which, again, I find quite remarkable. So Kosambi went to the US in the 1920s, actually with his father, who was a Buddhist scholar and who actually was visiting Harvard. So since our speaker today is from Harvard, I thought I'd bring that, I would highlight that aspect that he went to. In fact, he studied his high school. He did his high school at the Cambridge Rinch and Latin School, which is still there in Cambridge, next to Harvard University. And he did his high school, enrolled at Harvard. Between his father came back and he came back with him, but then he went back again. And he studied mathematics under George Birkhoff, who is, if you've studied mathematics at an advanced level, you would recognize the name. He's one of the very significant mathematicians, and of that time in the US, probably one of the leaders, who wanted him to concentrate on mathematics, but the ambitious Kosambi instead took many diverse courses, and he graduated in 1929 from Harvard, and which awarded him the Bachelor of Arts degrees with a summa cum laude. So this was, again, unusual for the time, because at that time, most educated Indians were going to UK, to Cambridge, Oxford. And so it was probably one of the first Indians to have gone and definitely studied master subjects at Harvard. Came back to India and was a professor at the Banaras Hindu University, where he taught German alongside mathematics, quite remarkable again. And but then the famous French mathematician André Weil, who had joined Aligarh Muslim University, hired him as a lecturer there, and he produced research papers in differential geometry related topics. Moved 1932 to the Ferguson College in Pune, a very hallowed institution, taught for 14 years. But so that brings us to 1946, which is when Homi Bhabha set up the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. This is a part, and hence the connection. So Kosambi was invited by Bhabha to join the School of Mathematics, and in fact, he was the first member of the School of Mathematics and held that position for 16 years. And but in that intervening period, actually from 1939 onwards, he gradually moved away from mathematical research, though he continued to publish papers in mathematics. He started foraying into social sciences, and it was his studies in numismatics that initiated him to the field of historical research. And his evaluation of data was by modern statistical methods. Now, again, I emphasize this because this is going to be one of the themes of the talk that you're going to hear Tarun, who incidentally also has a mathematics background, and is going to tell us about some interesting things that he's been doing. But it's quite interesting that Kosambi had a sort of a similar pathway from mathematics, statistical methods, into the social sciences. But at the same time, he was publishing critical editions of Bhartrihari's Sanskrit texts. So he was in TIFR for many years, but he had a falling out with Homi Bhabha, and eventually he left the institution. And at ICTS, in some ways, we wanted to sort of address a historical wrong in some ways by having this lecture in his memory. I will just close by quoting his friend, A.L. Basham, who was a very well-known historian and Indologist. You might have seen the book, Wonder That Was India. So he writes for Kosambi's obituary, at first it seemed he had only three interests which filled his life to the exclusion of all others: ancient India in all its aspects, mathematics, and the preservation of peace. For the last, as well as for his two intellectual interests, he worked hard and with devotion according to his deep convictions. Yet as one grew to know him better, one realized that the range of his heart and mind was very wide. And it is that range of his heart and his mind that we are here today to honor through the Kosambi Memorial. So with that, I will invite Professor Spenta Wadia to give an introduction to our speaker. And
thank you. Thank you, Rajesh. It's certainly a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Professor Tarun Khanna to the ICTS. And let me say that it didn't take much for him to accept our invitation. For that spontaneity, I'm very grateful to him. So Professor Khanna is the Jorge Paulo Lemann Professor at Harvard University. And his early schooling was done at St. Joseph's High School and the Bishop Cotton's School in Bangalore. Since native Bangalorean from yesteryears. And then he did his BS in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from Princeton University in 1988. And after that, a PhD in Business Economics from the Harvard Business School in 1993. And after that, he joined the Harvard Business School faculty. He has taught courses at Harvard Business School for 25 years and at Harvard College for the last decade on strategy, corporate governance, and international business to MBA and PhD students and senior executives. He is the first director of Harvard University's Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute that brings together natural and social scientists, artists, and humanists in joint academic pursuits. Fantastic thing to do, really. He's authored several books. I'll just name a few. One that I found most remarkable was, in fact, because I could relate to it, is The Foundations of Neural Networks, published in 1990. I tried hard to buy that book, but it was difficult. Then there are other books, Winning in Emerging Markets, Billions of Entrepreneurs, Contextual Intelligence, Trust, and Billions of Entrepreneurs. Many books with lots of insights. Do not really as yet appreciate fully. And he has collaborated with organizations as varied as the World Economic Forum, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and India's Niti Aayog. So Professor Khanna also co-founded Acceler Ventures, a venture capital network for young entrepreneurs. Other members of this network, of Acceler Ventures are well known to us, Ms. Krishnan and Mr. Shibulal. For his vast experience and erudition, the Government of India has appointed him to lead several committees connected to entrepreneurship and higher education. Comes to India often, and thank you for spending time in India for us. He was elected a Fellow of the Academy of International Business in 2009, and he was recognized by the Academy of Management as Eminent Scholar for Lifetime Achievement in the field of international management in 2016. Professor Khanna will be delivering today's ICTS DD Kosambi lecture on a pain to learning to see. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the lovely introduction to DD Kosambi, your kind words, Spenta, Rajesh. It's a privilege to be here. I always like coming to Bangalore because I spent my adolescent years in this lovely city, though it was much prettier then than it is now. I think, I did not know about Professor Kosambi at all until colleagues here invited me. But when I read about him, it was really quite inspirational because a lot of the activity in which I've been engaged at Harvard has been serendipitously been on the boundaries of applied mathematics, which is my core discipline really, and what I will now describe variously as the quantitative social sciences. And I'll try to illustrate that in my brief talk using a variety of examples of why I think this is an important consilience to bring about. Consilience is the name of a lovely book by the famous biologist Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who is emeritus professor at Harvard, who I have the good fortune to run into a while. But it's about bringing together knowledge bases and this ultimate idealized notion of the unity of all knowledge. Of course, not a new construct, but Professor Wilson has tried to breathe new life into it. For my various sins at Harvard, the then president of the university, who is a historian, asked me to build an institute that connected the university to all the countries of South Asia, from Afghanistan to Burma. Of course, India being the biggest country in there. And what she meant by that was to find ways to connect all the natural sciences, the social sciences, the arts, the humanities, the professions, all the scholarship that we do at Harvard and the teaching, somehow build intellectual bridges to the countries of this region. And that was the beginning of my meandering into, if you will, an empirical implementation of the idea of consilience, because I had to build an institute that brought all these people together. And as typically happens in our lives, we all get absorbed into our professional silos. And there's such a pressure for specialization that it's very difficult to look beyond our own disciplinary boundaries. And that's as true as if you're a mathematician or you're a historian or a linguist or what have you. And so the last 10 years for me have been an active struggle against the tendency to gravitate back to a home discipline. So I titled this Kosambi lecture, Learning to See. And what I mean by see is to look beyond the constraints and the prisons, if you will, imposed upon each of us by our own discipline. That's the spirit in which I use the verb to see. So in a sense, as you would have gathered from my brief introduction, my own trajectory is one from, it was never anchored in pure mathematics, it was anchored really more in the applied math, particularly on the boundaries of computer science and mathematics, theories of algorithms and that nature. A detour through mathematical economics, still trying to work out whether the detour was productive or not productive intellectually. but then a very productive meandering into a variety of social problems, which is what I really like to work on. And I end up approaching them through a collection of lenses. And I'll try to make the case to you in this lecture that learning to see is an act of human agency, that you have to actively force yourself to be in somebody else's shoes. Now, this is not a new idea. If you look at the history of scholarship through the centuries and through the civilizations, you'll see a variety of exhortations by the great and good saying that we should all learn to see in a variety of ways, but that's not the natural tendency. I'm accustomed to using pictures and slides, so I'll use them. I've given myself till 5 to speak, and then we can open it up if you wish, or what have you. And it's not relevant whether I get through the slides or not, so we'll go as long as we go. Working backwards from time, some of you, my home institution is very much Princeton University. I think it's the finest institution in the world. Honestly, it's really a privilege to have spent some time there. But I like this quote, when you think about what is the process of intellectual discovery about. I like this quote from Andrew Wiles, who's a prominent mathematician at Princeton. It's all about groping and probing and poking and some bumbling and bungling and looking around in a dark room until you happen to stumble upon an insight. And then you turn the light on and you say, oh, that's how it works. Okay, I get it. And then you go find another dark room. I think that captures for me a lot of the excitement and the mystery and the surprise and the serendipity of it. And then from my current backyard, I live in Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And one of the most famous residents of Cambridge, Massachusetts was Henry David Thoreau, the thinker, a naturalist. And there's a place there called Walden Pond, which is quite famous. And Thoreau used to spend hours, days, weeks, months simply walking around Walden Pond, and with a notebook at hand and spectacles and lenses of all sorts, simply cataloging things. And the title of this talk, this lecture, is from Thoreau. He said, we must look a long time before we can actually see. I keep repeating this. For some of my other sins, I'm a trustee of the Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, which is really one of the finest museums in the world. And somehow there has emerged between these two institutions, between the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and Harvard University, a nice connection. So that, for instance, as an example, if you are a physician training at the Harvard Medical School, you are required now to spend time at the Museum of Fine Arts as part of your core curriculum. The idea is that you have to, as a physician in training, you have to learn to see the patient. You cannot simply reduce the patient to a set of symptoms and measurements and diagnostic device readings and so on. You have to feel an empathy with the patient to truly diagnose what's wrong with them. This is something that had gotten lost, but I'm using that as an anecdote to illustrate that learning to see, again, takes a lot of effort. It's an investment. It's an act of human agency in some ways, and it permeates the world around us. And of course, going back to the 1600s, Immanuel Kant, in a famous critique of first reason, freely available on the web. I commend all of you to skim it in some ways. And I like this particular sentence, which is, it's very difficult to make progress purely, treating oneself purely as a theorist, if you will. That ultimately you have to surrender yourself to doubt and immerse yourself in experience. You can interpret what experience means in your particular field of human endeavor. As you can see, learning to see is all over. 1600s, roughly 1902, 1903, and 10, 15 years ago. And we could go further back and I would find you more codes like this. Anyone know what this is? What are these? Somebody? French caves. No? Good guess, but no. Yes. It's a what, sorry? Renormalization scheme. In a sense, but not quite. Good thought. This is Picasso, the famous painter, learning to see in some ways, and saying that he decided he was going to paint a bull. Pablo Picasso was going to paint a bull. This is about 19 40, give or take, right? Over a few months, over a year, actually no, more than that time, copying the Spanish painter who was Francisco Goya. This is exactly how Goya painted a bull, and he said, that's not quite right. And then there was a French painter, Durer, in Europe, who had painted a very famous thing called the rhinoceros. If you go on Uncle Google and say, Durer rhinoceros, something like this would come up. So he painted a bull in the like of a rhinoceros and said, that's not quite right. And then he said, well, I'm going to dissect the bull. So you can see him starting to dissect the bull, right? And then started to get inspired by some of the ideas of geometry, saying that there are ways to kind of section the bull in different ways. So you can see him struggling to do this. And then he runs into the French painter Henri Matisse, who is painting in single lines. And he says, oh, that looks like a good idea. I can combine Goya with Durer, with Matisse, and I can come up with this idea of minimalism, right? And finally, he says, this is the perfect bull. So this is not that different from what a scientist does or what an artist does, is you iterate your way to what you think is a solution for whatever the problem is that you set yourself to do. Now, you may think it's funny that this doesn't look like a bull, but to Picasso, that was the essence of the bull. And he was going to struggle and draw ideas from different places, right? And try to combine them and mix them and so on and so forth. Now, it turns out that, how many of you have Apple products? Anybody have an Apple iPhone? Yeah, iPhones, okay. So if you're an employee at Apple, you have to study this, because Apple is all about beauty and elegance and minimalism, right? So at Apple, you get hired if you're a very good engineer or a software programmer of some sort, but you also get hired if you're a very good artist, and you have to work with the artist. This was about breaking down the disciplinary boundaries between the arts and the sciences. Picasso's The Famous Bull series is an example of really an artist and a scientist learning to see through each other's eyes. That's what this is. So seeing is valuable, but quite difficult. Again, a series of quotes, right? I like this one, J.S. Mill, very famous economist, wrote some unkind things about Indians in his British era. But in this case, what he says, it's hardly possible to overrate the value of seeing the way that dissimilar people see the world. I think that's the theme of what has permeated my own intellectual journey and scholarship, which is learning to look at a phenomenon through a variety of different lenses. Very famous book, To Kill a Mockingbird, that every high school student in America reads as part of their courses on literature. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. You can never quite appreciate what the other person is seeing when they're looking at the same things that you're looking at. So again, it's an example of learning to see. On the off chance that anybody here is interested in art, does anybody know what these are? Correct continent, and that's about as far as you get. This is one of my favorite painters, the painter Michelangelo Caravaggio. Not Michelangelo, the fellow who painted the Sistine Chapel, happened to have the same first name, Michelangelo, a very common Italian name, Michelangelo Caravaggio. But when you see these paintings, what strikes you? What's the striking characteristic about them? Light and shade, yeah. So this is a style of Baroque painting, right, that Caravaggio was one of the primary exponents of. Where do you think this idea comes from, this light and shade? The technique called chiaroscuro or something like that. What is it? Chiaroscuro, yes. Yeah, I always get that phrase wrong. The technology of the ages was light, was the understanding of light. This is the time that Galileo Galilei came up with, he didn't invent the telescope, but he used the telescope to begin to question the prevailing geocentric model of the universe and said, no, actually, when you look at all these observations, maybe we should think about a different way of thinking about the universe. So Caravaggio was very influenced by Galileo. And he said, oh, this guy is sort of doing all these cool things with these instruments. You can look into this thing and look out. So Caravaggio, who was a bit of a drunk himself and was broke, set himself up in a studio, I think in Florence, I can't remember, and put a mirror in front of him and basically stared into the mirror and painted himself over and over again, experimenting with different forms of light and experimenting with contrast and so on and so forth. And this in turn influenced people who were studying what we would today call, well, the physics of light, optics and so on. So in effect, what Wilson, the biologist at Harvard, is talking about today of consilience was a normal part of everyday society, at least in Florentine Italy at the time. So I like this painting a lot, and I like this form of art. Most of us have trouble seeing the value of insights from other disciplines, right? And so, in my view, we forestall any prospect of creativity. I'm going to show you some interesting, so a bunch of different, so again, Picasso, a good artist copy, great artist steal. Combinatorics, the essential feature in productive thought. So most advances come by mixing and matching bits and pieces of insights that we have from different places. So I'm simply trying to make the case that this idea of the unity of knowledge, right, can be approached from a variety of different dimensions, is found all over the sciences, is found all over the arts, is found in the social sciences, and found in the professions. And there is, in some sense, nothing new about it. But by the same token, what's happened in society today is that we have become increasingly specialized. You think about our own institutions, we're either a biologist or a historian or a linguist or something like that, and then it's very difficult to break away from it. So here are two papers that I like a lot that are both written by a friend of mine, Ben Jones, who's a mathematical economist. He had two lovely papers. One is titled The Burden of Knowledge and the Death of Renaissance Man. Is innovation getting harder? So in this paper, he basically shows that what he's trying to say is that, if you want to train to be a specialist, let's say in one of the sciences, that the time that it takes to achieve a level of excellence, and you stipulate a threshold level of excellence, and you ask yourself, how long does it take somebody to get to that level of excellence? And you look across time, in time series, at how long it's taken people to get to that level. And what he shows in field after field, it's taken steadily longer, the monotonically increasing function over the last several decades. And his interpretation is that there's just so much more to know in a particular field that it takes you longer and longer to master it. And a corollary of that would be that if it takes you longer to master it, it takes you longer to come up with whatever your key insight is. Maybe you have a key insight. It shows that that's the case as well. And so on and so forth. In a companion paper in Science, which is a science journal, which I really like, Atypical Combination and Scientific Impact, they asked the question looking at about, I think it's 18 million academic papers in science over decades and decades. And they try to operationalize the concept of influence. What are the scientific papers that have had influence? And they try to look backwards and say, what characterizes influential papers? And their answer, to simplify at the risk of some degree of inaccuracy, their answer is that most papers are terribly banal. They are terribly pedestrian. You just sort of take bits and pieces of what's going on and move the needle a little bit forward. Not that they are not useful, they're useful, but in a very super incremental way. But the things that really move the field forward are these atypical combinations. So they operationalize the idea of, so in a sense, this is, if you will, a statistical validation of all this intuition. This intuition is a bunch of people, a writer, a scientist, a painter, saying that the way to make progress is to mix and match unlikely ideas. And Ben's and Brian's and all these guys out here, their combination is to say that even when you look in a particular domain of intellectual inquiry, the pure sciences, and you look at 20 million, 18 million papers that have been written in the sciences, across the sciences, you see strong statistical evidence that it's very unusual combinations that result in insights that are ex post treated as significant by future scholars. It's a really lovely combination to say that there is some a statistical regularity here, which I'm then interpreting for you in a particular way, and somebody else may have a better interpretation in the fullness of time, but that's my interpretation right now. So I'm going to switch to some of my personal experiences with these ideas that I've been talking about. So far, all I've done is tell you that there's nothing new about what I'm saying in a variety of different ways, that mixing and matching is the key, that to mix and match, you have to learn to see the phenomenon that you're interested in through somebody else's eyes. That typically means stepping out of your comfort zone, your comfort intellectual zone, and learning to be uncomfortable. The way I've operationalized this is the way, well, one way in which I learn something is I start teaching it. I force myself to go and start teaching it and force myself to start mastering it. Tried that with the language, I've tried that with mathematics, I've tried that with a little bit of amateur history. And so I started teaching a class at Harvard, which was open to the entire university. And so we've been doing that for 10 years. And the idea was to pick some of the most difficult problems of economic development in the poor countries of the world. So pick a problem, maybe there's a lot of corruption, maybe there's no clean water anywhere, maybe vaccines are missing, what have you. And think about how would you attack that problem? Think of it an abstract problem, think about how you would approach it, attack it, and then empirically think about how you might devise a solution that would benefit, hopefully, millions of people in poor countries around the world. That's the task of the course. It's simply called Contemporary Developing Countries. And what's happened over the last decade is that course has become quite popular, and it's evolved into a format which is really quite lovely. It's taught with a mathematician, with somebody from the professions, albeit mathematically literate myself, by an artist, by a physician, and an architect. All of us team teach it together. So we take the same problem and we essentially implement what Ben Jones and Albert Einstein and John Steinbeck and others are exhorting us to do, which is see the problem from a variety of different people's, through the lenses of a variety of different disciplines, so that you can appreciate the fullness of the problem. It's a little bit like the parable of the blind man and the elephant, right? So somebody asks the blind man, what does an elephant look like? And each blind person goes and touches some part of the elephant, and somebody touches the side of the elephant and says it's a wall. Someone touches the trunk and says it's a snake. Someone touches the tail and says it's a rope. So each of us comes to it. The architect comes with a particular disciplinary lens. The artist comes with a particular lens. The jazz musician approaches it differently. And you might say, well, this guy is engaged in a silly exercise. Why? What would a jazz musician have to say about the delivery of clean drinking water? Well, it turns out that a jazz musician approaches the problem with a different sensibility and ends up coming up with a bunch of crazy ideas that don't necessarily occur to the water engineer or the public health specialist, and so on. So that's what I've been teaching. And some of these things that have emerged come out of that course, right? Since this is the Kosambi lecture, and since Kosambi was an aficionado of history, I took the time to go and read the classical history of India that Kosambi had written, which was really quite fascinating. Didn't read all of it, I read most of it. And I thought it would be appropriate to start with a small study. It's not small, it's quite large, a study of the partition of British India that a mathematician friend and I are revisiting to give you a flavor of it. I thought it would be in honor of Kosambi. I don't have any full conclusions yet, but I'll share with you something that I hope you'll find intriguing. The second example I'd like to use is a study that we had 70 scholars do of the Maha Kumbh Mela in India. So for the first time, we got the government of India to agree that an academic institution could have a physical presence on the site of the Maha Kumbh Mela. So we had a Harvard tent at the Kumbh Mela. It was quite large, and we had 60, 70 faculty, graduate students, postdocs from every discipline come down to the Kumbh Mela, spend 30, 40 days there, and study a variety of things about it. And that project has been endlessly fertile. It's produced, dozens of manuscripts, books, videos, movies, case studies, statistical exercises. I'll share with you. So again, it's an example of bringing people together in a pretty straightforward way. All I had to do was pitch a tent in the Kumbh Mela and provide people modest funding to show up, and they kind of collaborated with each other. So in many ways, that's really all that it takes, that and the suspension of disbelief. And the last two here, if we get to them, are contemporary problems that I'm working on, which is the bane of developing countries these days is chronic disease, diabetes, cardiac disease, and so on. And a lot of the problem is accessibility to healthcare. And so, different teams of students and I are working on finding cost-effective, novel, scientific solutions to addressing these problems. So it's a practical implementation. And the last one here comes out of moral outrage. I think is a fair description of what I feel when I see that opportunities are in most parts of the world, but certainly in my country, in India, determined by the accident of your birth. You happen to be born in less propitious circumstances, it's very difficult for you to get to a good school and a college, and then your life's journey is pretty well set. So is there anything that I could do about this? So I spent 10 years working on this problem, and I can share with you some of the results of that. So we'll see how far we get through any and all of these. So let me start with this. Of course, is Kosambi's Introduction to the Study of Indian History, and this is the part that I wanted to fixate on for a second. This caught my eye from the preface to the revised edition. The original was written in the 50s. You remember that Kosambi passed away in the 60s, I think. Yes, yeah. So this extends to all historical periods of any country like India, where written sources are so meager and defective, while local variations are indescribably numerous. Now, 2-3 years ago, it was the 70th anniversary, 2 years ago, 70th anniversary of the Partition of British India. And there was a resurgence of interest in the phenomenon. Of course, it's something that's been studied forever by historians and political scientists and so on. And my family suffered the direct impacts of the partition. Both my parents migrated from what is now Pakistan to what is now northern India. And so you always heard stories about what this was like and so on and so forth. Put up these quotes about history to make one point. This is a novelist writing very recently in the New York Times. What is history? History is the word the English use for the record of every time a white man encountered something he had never seen and said, I found something, it's historical, right? This is a tongue-in-cheek, satirical statement. Very famous book, What is History? I recommend it to all of you, E.H. Carr. The facts speak only when the historian calls on them. It is he who decides which facts to pay attention to in some ways, and so on. So we kind of decided that, look, when we looked at the scholarship of the Partition of British India, it's true that it is very erudite, it's very accomplished, and at some level, I have no business writing about the Partition of British India because I'm not a trained historian. But I did decide that my mathematician friend and I would approach the Partition of British India with a very different set of lenses than the classical historian had. And in particular, I was very sensitive to this idea that it's not clear that the written sources that people are using to study the partition are really quite unbiased accounts of anything, really, because most of the written sources were produced by people connected to the British Empire. So it's very unlikely that they would represent the views of people who had to suffer the effects of the partition. And so right there is a problem in many ways, that you would never get the full effect of the... so that made me want to go back to it. And related to this was the idea, so we thought that what we would do is we would go to the survivors of the partition and ask them, what do you think about, what do you remember about the partition? And use that as a data source. How to operationalize this idea. Now, of course, the problem here is that memory itself is problematic, right? So we should acknowledge that at the outset. Daniel Schachter is a colleague of mine and probably the foremost scholar of memory anywhere in the world. He's got a famous book called Searching for Memory. So there's no such thing as the memory. Memory is how we experience something. and Oliver Sacks, the neurologist who passed away quite recently. Memory arises not only from experience, but from the intercourse of many minds. So it's a function of how you experience a particular event rather than a literal recitation of the event. So memory is problematic. But why not? So what we did, let me tell you what we did. What we did, we decided that we would construct a new data source. New data source would be to what we call crowdsourced memory. That we would go out and find as many as was practical in some sort of stratified sampling, people who had survived the partitions. Remember, it's 70 years after, and assuming that you had to be at least 5 or 10 years old at the time of partition to have any memory of it, you'd already be in your 80s, right? Your late 70s to late 90s. After that, you're likely not surviving. So this is probably the last little window to capture people who are still alive who actually went through the partition, including my parents, who are in their, dad is 82, my mom's in the late 70s. So like that, we created a research project to go out and find as many of these people as we could, and importantly, find them from contemporary Pakistan, contemporary India, and contemporary Bangladesh, as well as the diaspora, which would be in the Middle East, primarily London and the United States, and see if we could get them to speak to us whatever came to mind about the partition of British India, unscripted, not going with a questionnaire, but simply saying, what do you recall? What is top of mind to you? And treat that as a data source, and treat that seriously as a data item, that's the memory that you recreated. So we went and did this. I'm going to play for you some sounds of actual people who talked to us. So this is a publicly accessible data source. It's about 3,000 hour-long oral memories of the partition of British India. For the first time, a single study brings together Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladesh. That I think is already a contribution in because most of the data sources, most of the analyses are single country focused, and it's a contentious issue. So the perspectives are really quite different. I'll play some sounds for you just to get a flavor.
So there was a time that in our house there were 40 families.
They had adopted a Muslim boy who was an orphan. That boy had grown up in our grandparents' home.
15th August 1947, that night was a crucial night.
We remained there for some time. Then the camp commander was there. We got in touch with him that we kya kare. He said, "Aapko rehna padega. You have no food."
No friction, no difference. Hindus went to Muslims, Muslim came to Hindu houses.
We could never imagine कि हम engineering college में चले जाएंगे या कि degree मिल जाएगी. And so things happened.
We've got about 3,000 hours of audio like this. The question then is, this is just a map showing migrations of people. By the way, this is the largest involuntary migration in recorded human history, by far, much bigger than any of the crises going on today. The official British record of the death toll was less than, was a few 100,000 people, and their estimate was 3 million people across the borders. The contemporary studies from carefully pieced together data sets say that it's more like 16 million people moved as opposed to 3 million, and it's more like many, many millions died via crossing. So right there you see the limitations of the existing data sources. So what can we do with this data set? Well, we can, so this is a stylized individual. Sunil's story, here's an example. This is a guy who's telling us his story, saying his father was a goldsmith in Hakimwala village. This village was attacked by mobs. So they walked from Hakimwala to this place called Chiniot, spent a month there, then took a train to Lahore, crossed the border to Amritsar, stayed briefly at a Khalsa camp, boarded a train to Kurukshetra, stayed there for 6 months, moved to another camp for another 3 months, and then finally they were given some land in Haryana, and they settled. Going the other way, somebody named Ali lived in Ghazi, heard about partition on the radio, warned that they would be attacked, moved to one place, traveled during the night, seeing dead bodies along the way. So these are reconstructions of migration paths based on the oral story that the person is telling us, then geo-mapped onto a map. Finally ends over here. So we've got 3,000 of these reconstructions in some ways. And what we can do is essentially, it turns out that the United Nations is super interested in this kind of thing, right? Because they have to deal with refugee camps all the time. So here you have an instance of a data set being created to think about how you can house involuntary migrants in places. We're able to construct a taxonomy of refugee camps, ranging from places where somebody stays 2 to 3 days, transit camps, they stay for 1 to 5 months, a temporary settlement, similar few months, then a residential rehab where you stay more than 5 years. Many of these residential rehabs then become part of urban conurbations themselves and get absorbed into cities and so on and so forth. So in fact, one of my colleagues who participated in this study, who was an architect, essentially has been tracing the urbanization of northern India and Pakistan and showing that a lot of the contours of today's big cities, or tier 1 and tier 2 cities, are the results of these migratory paths where people settled and then refugee settlements and so on. So the fingerprints of it. This is another way to represent, these are just sort of 16 randomly chosen routes. You can see miles traveled from source, places that people stopped at in different ways. Now, each of these is a data item in some ways, and you can do all sorts of cool things with these data items to come up with analyses of different sorts. That's an example of what we're trying to do with the crowdsourcing of memory. And the intent very much is to make this a publicly accessible resource stored at Harvard University for posterity to use and access in different ways. It turns out you've got to be very careful about these kinds of things. It's sort of like the Holocaust Museum, which stores images and memorabilia from the Holocaust, which are currently stored in the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. The reason you have to be careful is that if you were an unscrupulous person, you could selectively pick and choose images to cause a lot of trouble, tell stories that are inaccurate or inappropriate. So there has to be a safeguard function that we have to build in to make it publicly accessible. It's an example of an historical event that's salient, whose legacy continues to haunt us, is perhaps the cause of a lot of the disquiet in this part of the world, and will continue to be a shaper of the political economy of the world. And we feel that it's not been studied, actually. It's been studied in one set of ways, with one set of data, and there are many ways to revisit it. So this was a small attempt to revisit it, intentionally focused on getting the views of 2 statisticians, mathematicians, to look at a historical event. Now, the reception by the community of historians has been really interesting and itself evocative of the kinds of problems that I was talking about. A segment of historians think that this was the most absurd exercise in the world, and that should be, in effect, ruled out of order, whatever the heck that meant, and a segment that thought that this was the most interesting thing to happen in history in a long time. And so my attitude is, well, I'll associate with the latter and see what I can learn from them, and ignore the former, and simply keep moving on, because nobody has a monopoly on analysis. So we'll all be free to approach it. Let me move to the Kumbh Mela, which is another event, and illustrate that. So this is a map of the Maha Kumbh. So the particular Kumbh Mela, so I'm sure everybody here has heard of the Kumbh Mela, but every 12 years you have something called the Maha Kumbh Mela, which is Kumbh Mela. And the major one happens in Allahabad. So we went to the Maha Kumbh Mela in 2013. So it's now 6 years ago. And this is the actual picture of the, so what happens in the Kumbh Mela, for those of you who didn't know, and I didn't know it despite being Indian and growing up in India. What happens is, this is of course at the confluence of the Ganga and the Yamuna. and the mythical river, the Saraswati, so to speak. But what happens in roughly January, February is that the river recedes its banks and clears out a space. But in a very unpredictable fashion, so you cannot predict exactly how the river is going to move. And once it's clear, an entire sort of city has to pop up to house the Kumbh Mela. Anybody know how many people come to the Kumbh Mela? How many? 3 crores, 30 million? Say 3 crores? Yeah, 30 million, okay, anybody else? So it turns out nobody knows. So we did a detailed study of how many people come to the Kumbh Mela and could find no analysis of it in recorded history anywhere, including by the people who administer it. There are numbers thrown around. So one of the exercises that I did, again, actually with a biostatistician, is we came up with the first quantitative estimate of daily attendance and cumulative attendance at the Kumbh Mela using some techniques we developed, and estimated that we could only estimate what we would call lower bounds. Right? We couldn't be sure, but we could say that it's definitely higher than this. And the lower bounds we estimated was a cumulative attendance of 60 odd million and a peak daily attendance of 30 million. So that's a lot of people. I think it was actually closer to 80 million. Like, I'm less confident of those bounds, but that's the order of magnitude. So it's a lot of people. Here's another way to do this. This is a map of Bombay, of Mumbai, right? Just to give you a particular city that you might associate with. The red is superimposed on this Manhattan, the island of Manhattan in New York, just to give some comparative geography, since I've used this slide in America as well. Number of people who live in this part of Bombay, this is sort of up to Bandra, maybe 6-7 million. So we're talking about on the peak day, 30 million people in a city that normally holds 6 million during the day. That's including people kind of coming into the city to work. And this is the river, the river. So this is pretty dense. You can think of it sort of as Mumbai plus Shanghai in a smaller area than that in a temporary city. It's a pretty amazing event that happens over 55 days. And somehow society has to plan for this in a very short period of time. And you essentially just have a few weeks to get the whole thing up and running. And then the river comes roaring back in, and so you've got to clear out before it roars back in. It's an extraordinary event, right? So we went there with, as I said, about 70 scholars who were from scholars of religion, scholars of law, political science, history, mathematics, statistics, public health, medicine, architecture, urban planning. So I and a couple of colleagues just pulled them all together, got the government of India to give us access to a tent. We had the Harvard tent on the Kumbh Mela. The sadhus thought we were mad, and we simply located ourselves there and watched and measured and participated in the entire exercise for days on end, made movies, so on and so forth. And it's just learning to see the world the way somebody else sees it. That's all. The way of creating that and giving it some physicality so that people actually can operationalize that construct. Just some images from it. These are temporary bridges across the Ganga. It's my best friend. But this is actually my data. My data are from that thing that he's got on his ear, his phone, right? So I then went to Sunil Mittal, the gentleman who owns Bharti Airtel or started Bharti Airtel. And I said, Sunil, it's such a noble cause. Why don't you give me all your data? Because the way the cell phone connectivity works in this is, remember, 60 to 80 million people are going to cascade in. They all need phone service now. This is the first Maha Kumbh Mela with cell phones, right? So I said, how are we going to do this? So Sunil said, well, we're going to have to construct an entire telecom network in no time. So we wheeled in these temporary towers into the Kumbh Mela. And I'm thinking ahead with these guys and thinking this is a very cool experiment because for the first time we've got sadhus with computers walking around while they're going through the holy bath and everything like that. If I could capture this, this is an amazing data source, right? So that's how my mind is working all the time. So we convinced him, but then the government of India got upset about this and said, no, you are in a foreign institution, you can't access the data, right? So I said, fine, we'll replicate a structure on Indian soil and capture the data as though data cares about which soil it's sitting on. But anyway, that's our bureaucracy. So we got the data in the way that the government was happy with. And we were able to measure calls, anonymized calls in some ways, text messages and calls. And this is sort of a reality check. These are just calls and text messages. This is a reality check. This is starting from Jan 1, 90 days. The Kumbh Mela actually is 55 days. You can see this is the I forget the name of the most holy day, the main Mauni Amavasya, thank you. This is the day when we estimated 30 million people, and you can see that, there's a reality check. The data kind of shows that, yes, that's the day that everybody came, the Kumbh Mela. This is, in the Voronoi tessellation, it's basically a construct in geometry. Essentially, you can think of each of these as a tower in the center of each of these, right? So that any point in this is closest to that tower in the center of that. That's all that it is. The tessellation is a very cool mathematical idea that has many applications. The pictorial representation, these are the denser ones where people are on that particular day. And so here's a particular paper that we wrote, which is about this idea called homophily, right? And this is one of the key insights. It turns out to be very important to crowd control and has become a part of how the Kumbh Mela now controls crowds. This is the key thing that I highlighted. Participants from low representation states show considerably stronger social and spatial homophily than those from high representation states, especially on crowded days. What does that mean in plain English? It basically says that if you are coming to the Kumbh Mela, remember you're coming. So who's coming to the Kumbh Mela? It's all sorts of people coming, Hindus mostly, but anybody's welcome. There's no way to check whether you're a Hindu or not, per se. So anybody's welcome, but you come from all over the world or all over the states. And so what we ended up doing, because we knew something about the cell phones, is we could tell which area you came from. And what we were able to show is that if you're from a part of India where there are relatively fewer people, you sort of come and you feel underrepresented in this massive crowd. And when that happens, you stick together even more. We were able to essentially show that. And in fact, when there is anything that's correlated with likely drivers of panic or crowds or mania or excess people coming in, it's tendency towards spatial and social homophily. Homophily is just affiliation with something that's like yourself, that you perceive to be like yourself in any of a number of dimensions, that this drive towards social and spatial homophily gets accentuated in those moments. Now, the implications for crowd control are pretty dramatic and pretty direct. And you can drive a whole bunch of different insights like this. This is one example. It's an example of what we were doing. The real point that I'm making here is that Kumbh Mela has been around for, I don't know how long it's been around, 500 years, 1,000 years, who knows? There's nobody studying it, nobody other than, there's a couple of pictorial studies of it, and there's a couple of historical descriptions of it. So all it really took for us was to set up a tent. That's it. Tell people to go there and just have a spirit of banter and a spirit of free inquiry, and work with everybody and see what you could do. What else did we do? We decided that this was a great place to study possibility of contagious disease and epidemics and so on and so forth. And surprisingly to us, the Ministry of Health had not really done very much about this. And I was very interested in chronic disease, particularly diabetes, which is an epidemic in this country and in many other countries, and turns out to be, it's not difficult to diagnose. You simply have a high sugar level, and but very few people get diagnosed. Still complications set in that are quite unfortunate. So we decided that one of the things we would do was try to see if we could come up with simpler ways to measure. And I'm going to now use the Kumbh Mela to deviate into my third example, which is about chronic disease, because there was a connection, since the Kumbh Mela was a place where we started to test for chronic disease in many ways, and that led to the formation of another effort, which led to the formation of a company and a nonprofit that now is involved in chronic disease testing around the world. So you can see the trajectory of kind of just meandering around, and in turn is leading to academic work in medicine at Harvard and other places. So what do we do? This is how people collect data. They have at the Kumbh Mela. This is not a particularly technically sophisticated way. It's people just writing down things that then get lost and shuffled, and nothing really comes of it. We basically showed that if you put in place pretty rudimentary sensors, the kind of sensors that you can buy for a few rupees, and put them in the river at select spots, you can predict when outbreaks of gastric disease are going to set in pretty easily and take preventive steps. You can simply, because remember, you've got 30 million people standing there. So if you have some disease kick in and that takes off, this is a real problem. In fact, one of the early spreads of some form of, I don't know if it was plague or some contagious disease in Europe, was traced back to one of the Kumbh Mela several hundred years ago. That people came to the Kumbh Mela, including the British officers at the time, since India was still under British rule. And those guys then went to Southeast Asia as part of the British Empire, and others went back to Europe, and they took the disease from the Kumbh Mela with them. This is a recipe for problems. But we showed the Ministry of Health that if you just put these few rupee sensors in different places, you could tell 48 hours before that levels of contagion were rising in the river, of things that were quite easily measurable, and you could take preventive action quite simply. So it's just a question of somebody applying themselves to that. But what I want to focus on is the chronic disease. So here you see a device that we set up and simply randomly asked people to come and be tested, see if they were diabetics or not. And we realized the power of having a simple device that allows you to do things quickly and seamlessly. So that's what we then set ourselves to try to develop a device that is cheap to be able to do testing for diabetes. That's the project I want to show why I had that. Here's the device. So this is the organization that we created. We meaning an engineer, a doctor, an engineer, and myself came together and said, and a design specialist, and I'll come to the design specialist in a second, said, can we create something that we call Aina, Hindi for mirror, the mirror of yourself. You're kind of testing yourself for chronic disease. Can we create a device that can plug into any phone so that in principle, remember the sadhu with the phone? In principle, if you're in that kind of crowded situation, or if you're in, I don't know, pick a remote place, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the middle of Africa, there are no hospitals, there's conflict zones, but everybody's got a phone. So you could, in principle, test yourself for any number of chronic diseases if we had this instrument that we were hoping to create. Of course, this instrument didn't exist. We had to then think about how we would do it. And in principle, if we had something that we called habits, that also didn't exist. The idea of habits was that if you had this small device, you could measure yourself wherever you were and upload that data to the cloud, so to speak, these days. And somebody could analyze those data and figure out if something was going on with your health. Or in principle, you could do that at the population level and see if there were problems emerging in particular locations, cities or countries or what have you. So that was the thought. So we did develop this. This is an actual picture of the device. Let me show you. The way this device works is it's essentially you put a drop of some kind of fluid from the human body. This is set up mostly for blood and plasma right now, but you could use saliva, you could use any number of other things. You put it on this, you insert a strip, right? So you've got a combination of different sciences coming together. Many of you in school, in high school, or would have done an experiment where you put a filter paper in Yeah, in a liquid, and then there's a chromatograph that comes up, and then you look at the chromatograph and you say, oh yeah, that's capillary action or something like that. And so it turns out in the old days, that's how people diagnosed diabetes. They took the capillary action, they held it up to the light, and they said, oh, something looks bad, right? So we went back to that old method and said, we can do that better. We can be much more sophisticated about the chemistry in the paper. The way we devise these papers in the labs is we have micro layers of different forms of paper to come together so that it interacts with the fluid that you're putting on it. Let's say it's blood. Somehow the blood leaves a trace in the spectrum. We take a picture of it, and then we optically analyze the image. That image tells us, yeah, there's some problem here or something like that. I'm simplifying it and saying it in simple words. So that's what we developed. It took us 7 years to develop a test for forms of indicators of chronic diabetes that you otherwise have to go to the hospital. But now, as a result, we're able to do it instantly on a phone, on any smartphone. This is now available in India commercially around the country. And it's instant and fast and so on. So what we can do now is we can test at the community level, we can screen, we can stratify people, we can treat them, we can monitor them and do something like that. And this is the part I want to focus on. It turned out that these three devices here, right? These three devices are all the same. But in this form, physicians in Bangalore who are endocrinologists and diabetologists didn't want to use it. They said it doesn't look clever enough. It looks like a plastic toy, which it is. It's a plastic toy, but it's an incredibly sophisticated plastic toy with a lot of science and a lot of patents, a lot of science, a lot of novel chemistry, so on and so forth. But they said, can you make it look more complicated so that it's more impressive to the patient? So we came up with a plastic housing like this for the physician offices and pharmacies, right? And then this is more of an automated one that makes it easier and easier to use. But this, moving from this to this to this and many other versions throughout is actually a serious act. It's an act of creativity. It's an act that requires you to work with a designer and an artist and somebody who can conceive of something that the patient reacts to and the physician reacts to well. And is often trivialized. But the fact of the matter is that nobody wanted to use them. It just looked too much like a toy. And this has turned out to be one of the more complicated parts of getting this device accepted in the marketplace. One of the things I like a lot about this is that we can now construct metabolic maps of Bangalore, right? Simply basically seeing where this device is available and show that, unsurprisingly, right? That, say, areas around Cubbon Park or Lal Bagh or something like that has much lower incidence of diabetes. Just that people are more active, walking around and exercising. So type 2 diabetes is a lot lower if you simply walk around. So that's just a simple correlation. I don't know whether my interpretation is correct, but in principle, we could do all sorts of stuff by doing these. So this is a country map where diabetes is prevalent, where it isn't. Putting up illustrative pictures of what one could do at the population level of screening. We did the same thing at the Kumbh Mela, essentially had those a sample of tens of thousands of people provide us with data. We gave it to the ministry and said, this is what's going on at the country level. This is the first time somebody has done this at the country level. You've got people coming from all over. There are many ways you could use it, but so far I've had no success with persuading the ministries to doing anything with it. So how are we on time? I'll say one more example, and then we'll close it. So this is well, what is this? What do you think this is? What is it? Sorry? Ellis Island? No. This is a relatively small city in China. It's a job fair. People looking for jobs. They're coming to basically look for a job. So this is a picture that actually inspired me to say, can we not somehow And we have this problem in India also, right? We've got so many people who need jobs, right? And no sorting mechanism. We have people going to colleges. Some of the colleges are good, some are not so good. There was a student at MIT, which is down the road from where my university is. He and I teamed up to create one of the very first machine learning applications for talent assessment, remote talent assessment, which we built into an organization and a research nonprofit, and then a commercial company for providing decentralized tests of all sorts of things that you could measure capability of all sorts in situations like this, so that there was a way to sort. And the applications of this are endless. For instance, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia approached us and said that we have a lot of migrants from primarily Muslim countries coming to work in the kingdom, but the less skilled among them simply show up in a mass, and then we're not sure what to do with them or where exactly to put them. Is there a way in which they could be tested in different ways so that when they came, we could see these are the different attributes that they're good at, slot them into different kinds of jobs? An example. Companies come to us from around the world and say, we're looking for talent of all sorts. Is there a way that you can streamline the talent assessment process so that you identify buckets of individuals that might be more or less suited to the particular needs that we had? Now you would think that this would apply to easy to think about ways of applying this to standard things that we would test for. But the ones that I really like are some of the, this is our China, are, tests of things. So these are tests for farm jobs. And we came up with these really interesting tests for motor skills, right? So so we came up with these games on tablet computers that are, so think about a plumber, right? What does a plumber need to do? A plumber needs to know a little bit about water and plumbing and so on and so forth, and design of how water flows in a house. But a plumber also needs manual dexterity. Needs to be able to move a wrench and so on. So how do we do that? We came up with a bunch of games. And the idea of these games is that it's on a tablet computer, and you have to kind of move your arms and shoulders and wrists to play the game properly. And we found clever ways, again, working with artists and scientists and algorithm designers, to come up with games so that the proficiency at the game would tell you something about particular skill sets and dexterity kinds of components, which are predictive of who would be a good A, B, C, D, E in a variety of ways. Now, nobody has tried to come up with computerized tests, machine learning adaptive tests of vocational testing. And we've been trying to get this to work, and getting it to work it's a commercially available test that people use. Getting mass adoption of it has eluded us yet. But I like this particular example a lot because when you think about big populous countries like India, lots of parts of Africa, where the match between talent and opportunity is very imperfect, if at all, this kind of thing would be a good signal for what a particular person might be good at or not good at. So I won't go through the rest of these. I wanted to end with this. So the Prime Minister's office asked me a few years ago, to come up with some sort of structure for entrepreneurship in India. Is there a way that you could use policy levers at the level of the government of India to nudge people in particular directions? And of course, as these examples of the Kumbh Mela and the partition and the diabetes testing and so on and so forth suggest to you, my bias is to bring different people of different kinds of intelligences together and get them to work on complicated problems. Because philosophically, I believe that complicated problems usually have a variety of causes, and the solutions are usually are going to elude a particular type of skill set. So we came up with a report, and the report had many parts to it. It resulted in an organization that's been created. It's called the Atal Innovation Mission. But the part of it that has worked really well is this thing here called the Tinkering Labs. And all it is just like at the Kumbh Mela, we put a tent together and people of all sorts came and began to play intellectually with ideas and came up with all sorts of novel scholarship. We're doing this in high schools across India. So far about 10,000 high schools across the country have got something called a tinkering lab, which is typically for high school and middle school students. And it's to inculcate a spirit of scientific inquiry amongst children. So instead of studying the way I was taught in schools in Bangalore, high school chemistry and physics, which is not particularly inspirational as best as I remember, memorize a theorem or figure out 6 different ways to crack a particular problem and go and ace the exam. This is all about playing games. So we create this space in the college and the kids are absolutely amazing, absolutely hands down amazing. All you have to do is put, some different materials of different sorts of elasticity and plasticity and material composition, a simple 3D printer, some laptops, some microscopes and this and that, and let them run loose. We then open up the lab to the community and we invite volunteer mentors to come in from the community and they work on the most amazing things, So these are examples of kids that, these are little printers, the high school, bunch of different competitions. This is the President of India, just observing this last week in one of the places. And so I thought with that happy image of trying to bring people together, I'll close my talk here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Thanks for that stimulating and wide-ranging excursion into so many different domains. At least for the young people, I hope that's sort of eye-opening. Questions? Probably some young person first, but sorry.
Up here.
Hi, it was a very wonderful talk. So I was quite intrigued by your entire idea of getting people from different disciplines to work together. What are the kind of challenges that you face? Because I also do something similar. I am trained as a science communicator with a background in science. And I often find that it's very difficult to broker knowledge between people who don't quite understand each other because they use a very different kind of language to talk. And it's always, the ice-breaking bit of the initial bit is always the most difficult. In your experiences, what are the kind of challenges that you face? Get these people to work together?
I think it's the challenges are very much what you have very likely experienced, which is we all have our own preferred language systems. The reason the language systems exist is that they actually make communication very efficient, except among, you're restricted to a domain of people who speak your professional language. My experience has been even in a large, vibrant university like mine, Harvard University, where you get really amazingly talented people come together. I would say the vast majority of people are, there are very few people who are dismissive of the effort to bring people together. I would say, let's say 10% are dismissive, 80% or 70% look at it from a distance. And I'd say only 15, 20% actually engage with it. And my attitude is, I don't know how to bring everybody together, but I'll work with the 10, 15% and then see where it goes. And typically you find that more and more people join in different ways. I think the example of the course that I teach at the university is perhaps an evocative example because it started with just me teaching it and trying to do a little bit of algorithm design to address some problems and then trying to say that these problems had arisen in society a variety of times so we could see it in the art of society in different ways. Then I had an artist join in. Then I had an architect say, I don't mind coming in and teaching with you about this. And before you know it, that entire community of people have come together and it's super popular and we all enjoy ourselves enormously when we teach it. It's my 10th year of doing it now. So perhaps a lesson from that is that we shouldn't let Look, none of this should be interpreted as a screed against specialization. It's not that. It's just saying that the specialization would actually be much more advantageous if a modicum of time was spent towards building bridges between the specialties.
Yeah, it was a very inspiring lecture. This question is, when you said that as the years progress, you know, the time required to get real insights, deep insights decreases. And the examples which you quoted from the history, I mean, reconstruction of history using statistics. So is it possible, or is there a possibility that we use machine learning, statistical and data, wherein we have the advantage of both speed and memory? Will it help in reducing this time gap to get better insights, or these insights is something totally different, something random, or as you said, confluence of, the thinking brought together, or, so whether the just brute speed and memory using machine learning will be a counterpose for this kind of more increased innovations and creativity?
So, you know, these days, machine learning is a solution to everything, right?
Yeah.
Any problem comes up, people say, let's do machine learning.
Or is there a way out?
No, so I think the way to interpret this is to say that, so that's the scholarship that one of my colleagues, Ben Jones, had done, which is to show that in any discipline, the time taken to first significant discovery is lengthening steadily over the past decades. Now, my way of interpreting your question is to say that, is there any way that that lengthening time can be, the rate at which it's lengthening can be ameliorated in some ways? And one partial answer surely would be that if we could also have this crosstalk between disciplines, maybe that's another avenue towards insight, so that it shortens the time to insight. I think that I am a big believer in. I think most, and it's borne out by at least that one attempt at finding statistical patterns of significance in broad ranges of science, which is that if you are able to access unusual combinations of stimuli, intellectual stimuli, it's far more likely that you come up with something novel. That seems intuitively correct to me, and borne out in a variety of individual instances, and borne out in the statistical patterns also. So that might be a way of shortening. I think it would still be a bit heroic to say that machine learning is going to be the engine to do that. That's my.
Good evening, sir. It was fantastic, You give 4 case studies, and probably 2 or 3 case studies there in your presentation. After this slide, in case you want to put another slide of our, Indian new education policy, what's your take on that, and what could be, your observation and advice on that?
Oh, India's new education policy. Now you're wading into contentious political territory. I don't know, honestly. I mean, I was educated here and through high school, and so, it was a good education. I have no complaints about it, but I would not describe it as a creative education. So when I contrasted with what my children who were brought up in America, with their, let's just say their first 7 or 8 years in school, right? It was much more a play education. They learn through playing. I'll give you an example. In a school that my children attended, which was a school where the great economist Amartya Sen, his children studied also. So when he knew that my children were going to the same school, he said, "That's the most wonderful thing you've done, because that school is the closest approximation to Santiniketan anywhere in the world." And it really is like that. It's outside, you sit anywhere and you study and you. But for example, the children for a full year studied whales. The topic for that year was, we're going to just study whales this year, right? So you're going to learn about literature through people who've written stories about whales. You're going to read the adventures of, whatever, Moby Dick, which is about whales. You're going to look at migration patterns of whales. You're going to look at rainfall patterns and how they affect whale migration. You're going to look at the way in which the whale spouts, right? And plot sort of histograms of spouts, right? To learn about statistical tendencies of mean and standard deviation. These are kids in 2nd grade, 3rd grade. Right? You manage to communicate ideas of migration, climate, statistics, literature. You learn the sound of the whale, the sound of the humpback whale, music, all through looking at the whale. And the child is happy to look at a whale, right? And think about the whale and swim with the whale and have a toy whale. It's so much more fun for the child. And all the concepts that you wanted to do are memorably etched in my children's memories. So you could ask my child when she and my son, when they were 7 years old, and they would tell you about standard deviation, right? And with no problem, not using the words, but they could tell you what it is, right? So I'm just saying, so we don't do it that way here. I wish we could. But.
I just have just one small.
Sorry, there are other questions if we have time.
First, let me tell you about Kosambi's Bangalore connection. He studied the Karaga festivals here.
Ah, excellent.
There are 160 different types of Karaga performances, and he did his field work here. And it is through request from his friends that the book, Introduction to Study of Indian History, emerged. Now, I want to know one thing. In these 3,000 hours of interviews that you have conducted, how many individuals were there? And is there any idea of where the conciliation between the citizens of two countries can emerge?
Yes, actually, so there are 3,000 hours. 3,000 is approximate. Some of them are 30 minutes, some are 90 minutes, but 3,000 people roughly. Spread across India, Pakistan, and to a lesser extent, Bangladesh. The one thing that pops out quite robustly is that when you look at, when you try to sort of put some quantitative measures on things that people are saying, beyond what I showed you, one of the very striking things, two striking things jump out in my memory. One is that whatever, and remember, this is all from reconstructed memories, right? So you're asking people 70 years after the fact, what do you remember? So remember that, that's the data set. So people are remembering in the course of reminiscing about partition, how they lived their lives before partition, what happened during partition, and what they remember after. And in those data, what you can see is that generally people who displayed a more positive demeanor before partition reverted to a positive demeanor in the long run. And those who sort of had angst about their lives before reverted to the angst. So in some sense, I suppose one interpretation could be it's about the resilience of human spirit. And there are lots of studies actually by psychologists saying that even dramatic shocks to your happiness have a half-life that's pretty short, right? In other words, you win the lottery, if you have a measure of somebody's happiness and you win the lottery and get a lot of money, you're happy, much happier for a little while, but then your baseline level of happiness returns to what it was. If you are at a certain level of happiness and you have an unfortunate accident, you feel alienated with life, but over time, you essentially revert to your baseline. It's very interesting, but that comes out quite dramatically. You can see there are distributions of espoused satisfaction kind of going back to baseline. The second thing that jumps out is that Pakistanis today, people who live in Pakistan, are a lot more positive about partition, even today, even if they have gone through enormous suffering. So I'll let you interpret it whichever way you wish. It's almost like that the act of partition is a validating sense of self-identity for them. And so regardless of what material difficulties that may have been visited upon them or emotional difficulties, at the end of the day, they're less upset about it. So those are two things that pop up.
Sir, as you have done some research on partition of British India, emotions and memories sometimes tampers original data. What is your comment on this?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand. Tampers? What do you mean?
Tampers data, because when it comes to taking data from the memory, sometimes emotion may mislead the data that they have to give.
Yes, that's right. That's why I prefaced those slides by saying that there is no such thing as a perfect memory. Memory is really more not a recollection of unvarnished facts about something. They're a recollection more of how you internalized it. At least that's what the scholars of memory tell us. So you should treat that data set for what it is. I'm not presenting it as an objective reality. I'm simply saying that these are how these 3,000 people reconstructed the memory. And it has limitations like anything else. I think it gives you, different forms of insight than sitting in the archives of the British Library in London would.
So it's about the partition that you have so much data on. But my take on it is that I have read actually a lot about the history of the partition, especially a very gripping account by a famous jurist called Ramanujan Sirvai. And there the narrative is about why the partition, history of
history of the idea, right?
Yes. So now, not understanding is the correlation between your data set, how it can illuminate anything about
why it happened. Well, I think you're right. The way that people have responded to the open-ended question, which is, tell us your reminiscences about the partition. So we tried very hard not to have it as a leading question. It's an unstructured data set, in that sense. So there are a continuum of possibilities that it sheds no light on, including this question. But it does shed light, I think, on the experience of the act of the consequences of partition, which is the migration, the forced migration, which I think is an interesting part of the consequences of it. But there are many things that it doesn't shed light on, including why partition happened. But the reason I find that interesting is that we are going through, in modern times, the maximal involuntary displacement of people from their origin places across the world, if you add up the number of involuntarily displaced people. And that number is going to spiral because of climate change in particular. There are many places in the world that are simply going to be uninhabitable. And there are places that are there's going to be a differential in attractiveness of location. So there is going to be a spate of involuntary migration. And I think there's just one more attempt to understand what that triggers. And so I think the migration paths, which we haven't analyzed, I just put up some pictures of them, are really interesting. So I'm looking forward to kind of diving deeper into that data set, see what it might teach us.
Take one question.
Oh, yes.
So there are people actually watching it, and there's a question.
Okay.
Sorry. Climate change.
Not me personally, but in the course that we teach at Harvard, we typically have 100 students in the class. So this year, the course is going on right now as we speak, and there are 100 students and 10 students in the class. And they typically work on projects. And so almost inevitably, 20% of the projects will be something related to climate change. And a common aspect would be to think about coastal areas, which would be unsurprising to you to know that those are places where you need maximal re-engineering of society in some place. And one of the things that's most fascinating to me is how much human myopia there is about this. So the city of Miami in the United States is almost certainly going to be devastated by climate change. But real estate prices are at an all-time high in the city of Miami. And I, for the life of me, cannot understand why somebody would buy property, expensive property, on something that you can literally see next year is vanishing. But there you have it. And I think the task for town planners and urban planners and so on, even in affluent places like Miami, let alone in Bangladesh, for instance, which is going to be devastated by climate change, is to think about form of habitat, the form of planning, the form of evacuation, and so on. I think we've made some strides even in India on this. You saw the cyclones that hit the east coast of India, Tamil Nadu and Andhra and so on. Our response times to those now are far speedier than they used to be in the past, thanks to people being proactive about it. Now, that isn't literally climate change, but that form of intervention and scholarship and policy making can have a massive impact on lives. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Let's see. It was a very good lecture, sir. Any future projects you have in mind?
Sorry?
Any future projects you have in mind?
Any future about 5,000 projects. I mean, there's, I'm fortunate to live in an academic environment where there's a project every day. Somebody's coming up with some large project. So,
and if we can associate with you, what are the possibilities of doing that?
Associate. That's a little bit harder, but you're free to participate, right? I mean, that's one of the nice things about the modern academy is that there's so much that happens online and through free communication of different sorts and blog posts and so on. And I encourage everybody to do that and be full participants in engaging in dialogue with people all over the world. One of the projects that I'm very excited about currently is a project with a Brazilian scientist on genome sequencing. And the thought is the following. So some of you would have seen that forests around the world are burning. Indonesian forests, Brazilian forests are burning. Why? Because for a poor person, it's efficient to burn and use the land to grow some crop and sell it immediately. That results in the destruction of ecological diversity and biodiversity. So then the idea is if you can somehow get people to realize that biodiversity has an economic value and allow them to participate in the realization of that value, they're much less likely to collaborate in cutting all the trees. And the cutting of the trees is worsening the climate problem in different places. So the project is a 10-year project, 20-year project. It's a crazy project, the craziest project I've become involved with in a while, is to sequence the genomes of all eukaryotic species, in other words, all species that have a nucleus, right, in the Amazon, and make that genome sequence available for all forms of research and commercial enterprise, and find a way to compensate people for it. Now, that's a complicated idea and a complicated sentence, but it's basically made possible because cost of genome sequencing is falling precipitously. And you can now almost have a genome sequencer in your pocket. There's a group at Oxford who's done that, and it used to cost millions of dollars to sequence the human genome. Now it costs a few $100s. So that's a big project.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful talk. I have two questions, one from chronic disease and another from Kumbh Mela studies. So my first is related with the minimalism of Picasso, which you have shown one picture. But the INA instrument in the market says otherwise, where instrument need to be more complicated than simple one. So are we moving or preferring from simplicity to complexity? That's my first question. And second is related to the Kumbh Mela. With your reference to your paper, sir, is the social gathering of large number of people is directly proportional to spatial connectivity? Is it also applicable to introvert people?
Well, the second one I can answer easily. We had no way to measure introversion, so I can't answer it because remember, we're using cell phone data to infer things. We don't have attributes of the individual, so that I can't answer. The first observation is interesting. It's interesting. I mean, the Picasso's 1945 Bull series is that person's attempt to come to the essence of what he thinks is a bull, right? You and I might not draw a bull that way. I don't know if I could draw a bull if my life depended on it, but that's his attempt at minimalism. I don't know what I make of your observation that it's odd that the physicians in Bangalore want a more complicated device so that they can come across to their patients as being more erudite and charge them more money for a test. But it's an interesting observation, so thank you for that.
On that note, let's thank Tarun again for
thank you so much.
It's a very stimulating talk.